Yep.
All these wires.
Right.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. And today we have a second day and a slightly different topic, although very connected. So Paolo today will speak about policy change in the European Union and also the welfare state change in a comparative setting.
Yep.
So I think that will be more or less the introduction. I introduced Paolo yesterday. I think that more or less the same people are in the room, and if not, then you could read the introduction online for the lectures. So let's have a nice and interesting time.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all. Today we're going to somehow go back in time. Yesterday we focused on the most recent developments, not only within the European Union, but more broadly speaking, about the interconnectedness of social policy on the one hand and environmental policy on the other. And we tried to focus on the development of eco-social welfare state regimes, although we saw that this may be not yet true in terms of having a policy mix that actually covers both risks in an interconnected way, but we saw that there are some connections, at least if we take the outcomes between performances on the eco dimension and performances on the social dimension. Today we will be a bit more traditional, if you wish, because we're going to focus on the development, the crises, and the difficulties of the establishment of European Union social policy, and in particular we'll ask ourselves, why is it that the European Union somehow missed an opportunity in developing a social policy or in supporting even more strongly social policy after the 2008-2009 crisis. We will see that we have some data that show how Europeans, actually European citizens, were asking for more social Europe. But it didn't happen. Or at least it didn't happen in a more consolidated and a more structural way. As you know, and we were discussing this yesterday, the competencies of the European Union in terms of social policies have always been relatively limited. Simply because, as we all know, the European Union was designed initially to cover other types of policies, in particular the creation of a single market, and therefore social policy was seen only as functional to reaching single market targets. Therefore it was residual, and it was primarily connected to the mobility of workers and the free circulation of workers within the territory of what we today call the European Union. A footnote here, we're going to refer to the European political organization as the European Union, even if, as we know, in the 60s we should be calling it the community, the European Economic Community. So we will just, maybe there's some lawyers in the room and they're not going to be very happy with this, but again, it's to simplify things, and I hope this can be acceptable. So what we're going to do today is try to understand how social policy developed, because it would not be true to say that we have nothing at the European Union, and especially after 2017 we had relaunch to a certain extent of European Union social policy. One of the articles that if you're interested you will read that I shared with your professor is entitled "Back to the Future" with a question mark, and I'm sure that you all are familiar with the title of a movie, which now is an oldie. But the idea is that after 2017, and in particular with the Juncker Commission, there was a rebranding of European Union social policy, in particular with an initiative that I think you are familiar with, which is called the European Pillar of Social Rights, which set some standards that actually had never been there for the European Union. So this is going to be our end point for this presentation, because we will not discuss the most recent developments. As a matter of fact, we discussed them yesterday, focusing on eco-social. We will just end with the idea that there has been a trajectory of European Union social policy that at a certain point seemed to go towards the end. Actually bring to a close European Union social policy. Today we can say that it's not the case for sure, especially after 2017, but we could also argue, in line with what we were saying yesterday, that European Union social policy is increasingly going into the eco-social policy, even after the COVID-19 crisis. So we have to focus more on policy mixes that are quite innovative and new for the European Union. Here we have the story basically until the end of the 2010s and the challenges that were posed by a number of crises. And we'll try, once again being a political scientist, we'll try to explain why there was a reduction in intensity in the production of European Union social policy, although there was demand for it coming from the European Union citizenship. So just some information regarding the background. As you all know, the European Union has been built not on social Europe. It has been built with other objectives, and it took, just think about it for a second, it took almost 40 years to get from the beginning of Europe, and we could consider 1952 as the first start before the European Union was built, or the European Economic Community in 1958. It took until 1988, somehow 1986, to complete the single market. So for 30 years, to put it a bit in simplistic terms, the European Union had only one goal. That was to develop the single market, make sure that the economic and commercial integration could occur, and many other policies, if ever came on the agenda, were residual and complementary to the main goal, that was to create the market. So this is very much in the background. Clearly, when we started having, after 1986 and after Maastricht, the Treaty of Maastricht, we had an expansion of competencies. And again, if ever you need more information on this, we can take it in the Q&A session. And in this expansion of competencies, we also started to have a discussion that then was codified within the Amsterdam Treaty with a specific title devoted to employment policy. So in 1997, we could start thinking in terms of a fully developed European Union policy with reference to employment, and we'll come back to this later on. So basically, we could say that from the end of the 50s until mid-90s, not much happened. But just like for many other policy trajectories and development, we have to look at incremental changes that actually start a bit earlier. So what we will do today is exactly try to focus on how welfare state policies became increasingly relevant, but then at a certain point were not considered as central anymore, and since the mid-2000s they started to become increasingly residual. At a certain point, I was teaching on a yearly basis a class on social Europe in Italy, and towards the second half of the 2010s, I started to say, well, we have to quit this class. Why? Because there was nothing new to say. Either we transform it into the history of what could have been a social policy in the European Union, or otherwise we have to just cancel this course, because this short course, because it has no meaning. But then 2007 and 17, we had the changes that I was referring to previously. So at the end of the day, we decided to continue, and this is why we decided to go on together with a colleague. This work, the works I'm referring to in this presentation are joint works, one with Miriam Artlap from Freie University in Berlin, and one with Beatrice Carella from currently the University of Milano and Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. So we said we need to understand what seemed to be the end. This was the article in Journal of European Public Policy with Miriam Artlap, and then see what seemed to be the relaunch together with Beatrice Carella in the Journal of Common Market Studies. So here we have a puzzle that actually motivated our research. That was, we had several crises over the past years, as we all know. In particular, here we're focusing on the crisis, economic crisis between 2008, 2009, that actually in many countries was, as you may recall it, a double dip recession. Because it was not only 2008, 2009, but for many countries it was also 2011, 2012. I don't know exactly what the situation was here in Lithuania, but I think that it was not hit by such a double dip recession. It was only the first. In Poland, for example, and in Hungary, you had no double dip recession. In Southern Europe, in Ireland, you did, and some other countries. So for some countries, it was a double crisis connected to the economic and financial turmoil that occurred towards the end of the 2000s. That, again, you're all familiar with, so I'm not going to go into the details of that. And the question here, why is it that, given the intensity of the crisis, the European Union had not gone along intensification of social policy? That is, has not expanded social policy. We'll talk about welfare state developments after the break, and we will see that both in European countries and in Latin America, there have been periods of expansion and of retrenchment. Here we would have expected expansion, or we could have expected expansion, due to the fact that, as we will see, the crisis actually was accompanied by greater demand for social Europe coming from citizens. Of course, this would be a good and valid hypothesis if we had a European Union that actually functioned as a political system. But we'll see, and this is one of the findings of the research, that this is not exactly the case. But we'll come back to this later on. So what actually we saw, and again, we will start from some information on the 2010s, was not an increase of European social policy at the European Union level. On the contrary, until 2017, we had a contraction or retrenchment, although retrenchment is a bit too much because we never had a fully expanded and a fully existing welfare state at the European Union level. As we know, we do not have a European Union pension system, we do not have, notwithstanding attempts, European Union health system, and we could continue. We just had, as we will see, a number of initiatives that nevertheless became increasingly important in steering and coordinating policies that were still adopted at the national level. So, as we will see also in a very innovative way, I'll be right with you, in policy terms, the European Union managed to intervene in policies that had remained primarily domestic, but were increasingly coordinated at the European Union level. And therefore, there were changes that we may refer to in this talk. Yes?
How does scholars measure decreasing or increasing on what?
Right, this is, absolutely, this is, as we will see, this is the first research question. So, how do we consider decrease or increase of European social policy, given the fact in particular that we do not have high social expenditure in the European Union? As you all know, when you try to measure, quote unquote, changes in the welfare emergence or expansion or retrenchment, the main indicator, the main measure that you focus on is social policy expenditure or social expenditure. As you all know, when you try to, one of the main differences that Espen Andersen was focusing on in terms of the varieties of welfare states, and many others did, was the intensity in terms of expenditure. So well-developed welfare state is a welfare state that is also quite costly. And therefore, in the Nordic countries, you have welfare states that are costly, and therefore you have taxes that are high, all things that you're very familiar with. In the European Union, it's a bit more complicated because you do not have that big of a budget that goes into social policy for the reasons we already referred to. So how can you measure the decrease or increase? You look, as we will see, at policy initiatives. So, for example, in the 1997-2004 period, we had a development of numerous initiatives that were aimed at the expansion of the so-called open method of coordination. Is anybody familiar with the open method of coordination? Maybe not, and again, this is hopefully some added value with reference to what you already know, because it's exactly the way through which the European Union, and in particular the European Commission, came into the domestic welfare states that, as we were saying yesterday, are very resilient to change because the politics at the domestic level do not want to often share competencies on such a politically salient policy. So, with this respect, we will say a bit more. We also focused on regulation, that is directives primarily in social policy. So we have the number of regulation, and we will see that number of regulations in terms of directives, so a number of directives, and we will see that there has been a decrease. There are some moments of expansion and some moments where the directives decreased. But clearly this is a very good point, because we could often in the social policy literature, there's this idea of just focusing on the developments of policies, and not that often, at least this is in my reading, is there a clear statement of what we're measuring in terms of policy change. I don't know about yourselves, but sometimes I get a bit frustrated in reading articles that tell us about the recent developments in a given country or in a given territory, or in a given region, saying this was a huge change, let's describe it and then let's evaluate it. Typically, this is a classic social policy article: description, evaluation, or prescription, which again is absolutely fine, but it may not be analytically very well structured. Therefore, you may miss the dimensions of change, or you may not fully understand what exactly has changed, and let alone the why question, which is not that often at the heart of the interests of social policy analysts, which again is fine. It's a field which goes in a slightly different direction than political science. But in this case, and in other pieces of work that I developed with colleagues and on my own, we try to take very seriously the notion of policy change. And here, not having a well-structured policy, so we do not have lots of resources, we do not have very sophisticated procedures, although, as we will see, we have some innovative procedures. We do not have very well-developed principles. We have some objectives, and we will see that these objectives became increasingly less ambitious until Juncker came back in, and for legitimation reasons wanted to go back to social policy. But this is going to be the end of the story, so I will continue with the first part of the story. So instead of having an expansion of European Union social policy initiatives, we had decreasing relevance. Here we are talking about relevance in terms of initiatives, as we just said, notwithstanding the crisis, and increasing concern of employment and social issues. Here we could ask ourselves, as we will see, the same question: how do we measure concern? Here we use Eurobarometer data, and we try to combine questions. Unfortunately, there's not one question that we would have loved to have. That was, would you like to have more social Europe? Unfortunately, this question was not there, and as you know, paying a survey with, at the time, 28 countries would have been impossible for us as researchers without having huge funds. So we had to rely on a combination of questions, and in a very simple way, we just put them together in the waves of Eurobarometer. And as we will see in just a few seconds, actually there was a steady and actually growing request, concern, for employment and social issues, and in particular, this was combined also to a request of more powers to the European Union. Of course, we could argue that this is a very gross and very not sophisticated proxy. Absolutely right. You could criticize me on this, and unfortunately, I'll just have to say, okay, just hit me, because there's not much we can do. Again, as said, we didn't have the right question. We had to take what we had, and in taking what we had, we tried to develop our argument, and at the end of the day, apparently we convinced the reviewers of a journal which is quite important, the Journal of European Public Policy. So this is not to say that everything was perfect, but to say that we argued, and maybe this could be something also relevant for those who want to continue and publish. Sometimes you know that you have some arguments that are not as powerful as you would want them to get because you don't have the right data. This is often an issue. But if you provide all the evidence that that's the only data you have, and you provide the evidence that the research question is interesting enough, then you will convince most likely the reviewers. And as you know, this is one of the toughest things that we have in our profession, to convince reviewers that what you're saying answers in a proper way the so what question that we were also referring to yesterday. So how and why did this happen? That is, what is it? Why is it that, first how, and then why is it that we didn't manage to see an expansion of the European Union? Once again, being primarily a political scientist, I'm very interested in theory and in trying to test theories, or in trying to test explanations if theories may be a bit too strong as a term. So in this case, we try to go back to some of the key theories of European integration. Yesterday, as you may recall, for those who were here, we were referring to the post-functionalist theory of European integration. Here, we referred to the more classic ones because we could argue that the party-based bureaucratic politics is, to a certain extent, very much in line with post-functionalism, and not only with functionalism or supranationalism. And the first, therefore, set of explanations was connected to the power that was in the hands of the European Commission, and within the European Commission of those parties that connected the European Commission to the European Parliament on the one hand, and to the governments of the member states on the other. So this is not only one of the explanations that we try to test with reference to the development of social Europe, but also has been one of the explanations for the expansion of European integration. Maybe not, again, party-based. This is the post-functionalist revision of the functionalist theory, but in the neo-functionalist reading back in the 60s, 70s, there was this idea that competencies would have triggered spillovers, the sharing of competence would have triggered spillovers, and this would have provided an opportunity for the European Union to develop over an increasing number of policies. In the 2020s or late 2010s, we could also take a bit more seriously the politicization hypothesis, or the identity formation hypothesis that is connected to what we were saying yesterday in terms of post-functionalist theory. On the other hand, we have the classic intergovernmentalist argument. We could have the intergovernmentalist argument, that is, it's all about domestic preferences, domestic government's preferences, that especially when with the entrance of Sweden in the European Union. As you all know, Sweden was not one of the founding partners, so to speak, of the European Union. It joined in 1995. And just like for all important policy developments in the European Union, you have to always keep under control the enlargement process, because enlargement always triggers very important initiatives before and after. And I can have several examples to share with you, but we don't have the time for that, just to make sure that this is also another piece of information that you have. So it's not surprising that Sweden was seen as one of the key actors in supporting and promoting social Europe, and as we see, it did actually support the relaunch, or actually the launch of social Europe in the mid-90s, and the alliance, so to speak, with the European Commission, in particular Jacques Delors, remember we were talking about Jacques Delors yesterday, is actually, as we will see, at the heart of the development of social Europe. So another explanation could be we had only intergovernmental bargaining, we had member states, governments that were pushing for it. Okay, this could be an explanation. Let's then see if actually this happened or not. But it was one of the explanations, a la Moravchik, if it rings a bell. To some of you, a scholar working at Princeton that worked a lot on intergovernmentalist approaches to the European Union, and basically there would be intergovernmentalist argument supporting the reading of the European Union in terms of expansion. Finally, and this is somehow the classic political system hypothesis that we will try to develop in this figure, a systemic or a structural functionalist approach would say clearly policies change if the voters change ideas, or policies go in one direction if this direction is the one that the majority of the voters want. Very simple. Here, if we apply this systemic or structural functionalist approach to the European Union, in a nutshell, this would be the political system. By the way, this is taken it's taken from work that was done back in the 50s by David Easton, a political scientist that was working on the definition of political systems. For us today, this is quite obvious. At the time, trying to frame politics and understand politics was not yet at the point as we are now. So this was very important in order to systematize the understanding of politics altogether. So the basic idea is that we have three main dimensions in any given political system. One is political authority, and the political authority is made of the institutions. One is the political community made of the voters and various actors that intervene. And finally, you have the regime, which is the set of rules of the game that connect the political community and political authority. What does it mean for the European Union? We would have, in the crisis, the environment would be the social, economic, political environment within the European Union. We had in the input, remember the input-output democracy that we were referring to yesterday. This is when you input your preferences, input your desires in the political system, in the policy formulation, for example. And here we had a crisis that was very present and towards the end of 2000s and beginning of 2010s. So there was a demand for more social policy, and we'll see the figures in just a second, or at least this could be the interpretation that we could give of the data. And at the same time, the only way through which the input democratically actually occurs in the European Union is directly through the European elections. If I'm saying something that is not clear, do let me know, okay? Because I see your eyes that are still waking up, which is understandable. And at the same time, in some cases, I see them very with me, and in some other cases, a bit lost. So do stop me if you are too lost, or even if you're only slightly lost, because as we said yesterday, my main goal here is that at the end of these 2 days, we have shared information that actually we properly understood. Otherwise, I said I could go on and talking for hours and maybe enjoy it, but it would be completely useless. So here we have the input, and we have to focus on these two pieces of information, and we will look at the data just in a few seconds. And then here we should have the increase or decrease of social Europe, the decisions under the form of policies. Demand for social Europe, how do we measure it? As we said, we unfortunately do not have the wonderful magic question in Eurobarometer. So we know that indicators, measures are not going to be as satisfying as we would want them to be. So we have to find some proxies. And here we had some questions, as I was already mentioning earlier, that did provide some information, that did actually give us some information in terms of growing concern. And here the point was, the question was what are the main problems, or what are the main concerns, this was the term used in the questionnaire, that you currently have as a member of the political community, as a citizen. And employment issues were always at the top. And actually we're growing over time. So here we have data from mid-2000s and mid-2010. And at the same time, you have another question. Here you have the references that then changed over time, so now you would not find the same questions. The other question was, would you like more or less powers in the hands of the European Union? Again, as you see, combining these two questions is not as satisfactory as we would want it to be. Because we could argue that you want more competencies, but not in social areas. Correct? But again, we just connected the two and saw that there was a connection also in terms of those who were answering. So it was high probable that if you had concerns for unemployment, you were actually asking more powers for the European Union. So we inferred that there is a connection there. Supply, that is the policies, the regulations, if ever. There are no regulations actually, with exception of some regulations that govern the regional policy, such as the European Regional Fund that actually does provide some funds for social policies, but they're very minor. So mostly we have directives in the regulatory mode. Then we have some other initiatives that are going in the direction of the open method of coordination that we will talk about later on. And then, on the other hand, we have evidence, again, of the decline of social Europe under the form of the development of the so-called austerity package. So how do we measure the supply? We focus on legislative production. We focus on policy initiatives that go either in one direction, that would be social policy, or in another direction, which would be against the social policy. Everything clear so far? Any kind of, more or less? Please, yeah, please help me making it more clear.
No, I think it's very nicely demonstrated how you selected and identified the proxies here or indicators for your research. I'm just having a question in my mind about the growing concerns. I think about, for example, this is a fair argument, but yes, for example, during I imagine the Great Recession, yes, there were for sure growing concerns of unemployment and social issues, but also a lot of concern over the economic, fiscal, and monetary, like all the stability on the fiscal level as well. And we had the crisis, also with in the southern parts, especially of Europe, yes, debt crisis. So you probably demonstrate that. So I'm just thinking about multiple concerns, and they all grow at the same time, and then they might be conflicting.
Right. Well, thank you very much for this, because it, I think, helps to clarify which concerns we're focusing on. Because as we will see, some were very much concerned, the governments, several governments, not only the European Commission and the Council of Ministers or the European Council, but also the governments themselves were very much concerned about the economic and financial consequences in terms of stability of the European Union from an economic and financial perspective. So we did have a number of measures that went under the label of austerity package that, at the end of the day, as we will see in greater detail later, actually were going in an opposite direction, but it was responding to the concerns of some governments. The concerns we're looking at in this research are the concerns of the political community, whereas the concerns that you were referring to are the concerns of the governments that are part of the authority. So indeed, we could argue, we didn't do this in the article because we took it for granted, but this is a very good point. We could argue that there was a mismatch also between the concerns, but the question is why? Because if the idea is that in democracies there's a correspondence between the preferences of the majority of the voters and what the government does, how could you have such a difference, such a mismatch? As we will see, you can have this for a very clear reason that is connected to the function of the European Union, but I don't want to go too further yet. So I hope I clarified this, but this is a very good question. You may have others, and please go ahead if you have any doubts or any uncertainty, because as said, my main goal is that we are on the same page on a constant basis. So, okay, shall we continue? So again, supply of social Europe. What do I mean? Here we have the data that was collected by my colleague Miriam Altlap, so it's her merit for sure, and I am a free rider here because this was another project, a great project that she was working on. So here she collected, together with her collaborators, a number of pieces of information regarding the directives since the early 70s. And here the study that we published was published in 2019, so we stopped at the middle of 2010s. And here we have not only the number of adopted directives, the dark color figure, but we also have pending directives, number of non-adopted revisions. So these are non-adopted revisions. So there are proposals of the commissions that actually were not then adopted. Number of non-adopted directives, for example here, then here you do not even have directive, but you have revisions, and number of adopted revisions. So unfortunately, it's not that easy to see. I'm afraid from where you are, it should be easier to see in the paper. But in a nutshell, what you can easily see is that we have moments of intense production of directives in the social policy field between 1986 and 1992-93. Not surprising, because this is the period, 1986, when the single market was completed. And as we said, and as we see also in research, the single market had to be completed also thanks to social policy provisions that guaranteed the free and fair competition. So social policy was harmonized, so to speak, in terms, in particular, of employment directives or employment policies, because it was needed in order to avoid social dumping or to limit social dumping and to avoid a competition that would have not seen as a fair competition. And then you have, this is our period, so to speak, you have the 1993-2004 plus an appendix of some directives that are connected in particular to enlargement. But from this moment on, that is from mid-2000s, because this is, if you wish, kind of a continuation of what was discussed and previously put on the agenda, we virtually have nothing with the exception of some proposals, some pending directives that then were actually not approved. So this is one indicator. Another indicator, which is more qualitative, regards the development of the OMC, which is the Open Method of Coordination. 1997, we already referred to this date earlier because it was the day, the year when the Amsterdam Treaty was approved. And as we said, the Amsterdam Treaty is particularly relevant for us because it was the treaty where, for the first time, we have the inclusion of a full title, which is a set of indications regarding a policy, on devoted to employment. So 1997 is really a life changer for European social policy because it introduces the open method of coordination with reference to employment. What is the open method of coordination? Since we are not very familiar with it, it's the only way through which the European Commission could actually enter into the welfare states at the national level. Open, because it's open to multiple stakeholders, not only governments, but also increasingly social partners. So the idea is that it's an open method in the hands primarily of the European Commission and of European institutions altogether, but the Commission in particular. And it's a method of coordination. It's not a method for decision making or for adoption of binding policies under the form of a regulation. Here in the open method of coordination, we have no regulations, we have no directives, we typically have recommendations. And as you may know, the recommendations are not binding. As we will see, they may have an impact because through benchmarking as a country, and I know this story very well coming from Italy, you may not want to always be at the end of any ranking. So year after year, there are soft but ongoing and direct pressures towards change. And in another seminar maybe that could be given in another year, we could go back to policy change in Italy over time due to the soft pressures coming from the European Union. But we're not going to do that today. So it started with employment. Under the form, how does it work? And again, this can be interesting for those who are focusing on multi-level policy making. Open method of coordination starts with some, now it's very similar to the European semester, by the way, and you all know what the European semester is. You start with setting goals and objectives on a yearly basis at the European Union level. Then this document goes to the governments. The governments have to follow the coordination coming from the European Union, and therefore they have to show what has been done and what is going to be done in order to comply, quote unquote, with the requirements that come from the European Union. Then there's a document, in these years the document were action plans. So it was the National Employment Action Plan, the NAP, National Employment Action Plans, NEAP, or many other acronyms that have been used. And then you had other plans that followed. These plans were evaluated by the European Commission, and then a decision was adopted in terms of recommendation by the Council of Ministers that said, basically, to put it in a very simplistic way, you did well on A, B, C, you did not so well on D and E, and you did terribly on a number of other points. So this is a constant, although soft, pressure that actually did exercise some changes at the national level. So this is why we can say that at the end of the day, the open method of coordination under specific conditions was effective. And this is where the Europeanization literature told us a lot about how the conditions have to be met in order for changes to occur. So it started with employment, it continued with social assistance, it continued with pensions and healthcare. So in the early 2000s, it seemed that the open method of coordination was going to cover the most important functions of welfare state. As you may have noticed, we do not have education, we do not have housing, but education somehow was considered with respect to vocational training and employment, and housing was also part of social assistance. So early 2000s, social Europe did exist. Under a very peculiar form, we had coordination, we didn't have exclusive legislation, so we didn't have the European Union welfare state. But we had the European Union social policy that was coordinating the functioning of the welfare states at the national level. So it's the moment of maximum expansion of the coordination. But then, between 2000 and 2004, we start having criticism, governments that are starting to be a bit annoyed by these constant pressures, because at the end of the day, for some years it was good because you could play the so-called blame avoidance strategy. What is the blame avoidance strategy? What could it mean? I want to get you a bit more with me. What could be the blame avoidance? You know what a blame is, right? So blame avoidance, how to avoid blame. And this was between the late 90s and early 2000s, it was the most preferred card until 2001 in particular, played by Italian decision makers, Italian governments, not only in Italy. There was this mantra that was, Europe wants us to change. And to a certain extent, it continues all over the place with the Recovery and Resilience Fund, because it's condition-based, as you know. We were discussing this yesterday. So if you do not follow the rules, then you lose funds in the National Recovery and Resilience Funds. In the open...
I think in Lithuania this is one of the strategies that is very popular in the sense that when you need to do some unpopular, make some unpopular decisions, then the Europe is to blame.
Exactly.
But, yes, but when you use some European funds, I don't know, at the municipal level or at the national level to do some reforms, then normally this is our merit, we implement it and so on, but this is probably very natural of the politicians.
Absolutely. We are trying to describe and understand, right? So clearly, the blame avoidance strategy is a very effective strategy, because when you will formulate or adopt an unpopular policy or unpopular decision, cutting pensions or cutting benefits or providing more conditionality on social policy and social inclusion, then of course if it's you will pay electorally, or it's highly probable that you will pay the bill from an electoral perspective, because you will be the one as a politician to be blamed. But if you manage to avoid the blame by saying, hey, I would have wanted so much to keep the benefits as they were. I would love to give you even more pensions, but, hélas, it's not in my capacity to do so. True to a certain extent, as we know, because it's soft. It was very hard conditionality if you wanted to get into the Eurozone. This was the Italian story of the second half of the 90s. So that was a blame avoidance with a clear goal that wanted to be reached by the government. But in other cases, it's not necessarily that true. So you're playing the game, the political game, which again, we may not like, but politically we see it all the time, to avoid the blame by saying it's not us. We're forced by an external actor, in this case the European Union, or the market. There's also the market as another ghost that is always mentioned by politicians, increasingly mentioned by politicians. We cannot decide. Our hands are tied by the market. Which, again, sometimes is true if you have a position, a depth position, which can be therefore punished by shareholders and people that are actually operating in the market with huge players in the market, but not always will it be true. So, going back to this blame avoidance, in early 2000s, enough with blame avoidance. The government started to say, because we had the beginning of Euroscepticism wave. And again, I don't want to focus too much on Italy, but since 2001, Italy was a very good case, because until the end of the 90s and early 2000s, Italy was Euro enthusiastic. Whatever happened in the European Union, yay, it's wonderful. The political community was really very, very satisfied. Italian rates of satisfaction not with Europe, but enthusiasm, which can be measured via Eurobarometer's question, how much trust do you have in European institutions, was the highest in Europe. But then it rapidly declined, and it continued to decline, and it was not only an Italian story. In many countries it declined. These are the years when the neo-populist wave starts to become relevant. These are the years when you have growing concern about the European Union, and let's not forget that 2004 is the enlargement, yes, but 2005 is the year when two referenda, almost three referenda were actually saying no to the European Constitution. So we came to a big stop in terms of expansion of broad competences of the European Union. And it all started in the early 2000s. So also the government started to say, I'm not so sure that I want the European Commission to be so intrusive in our welfare states. I'm not so sure that I want to actually follow the rules that are put forward by the European Commission. So at least in terms of the social policies, broadly speaking, the welfare provisions, I'd like, as governments, to go in another direction. But even more so, 2004, as we said yesterday, is the big enlargement. 10 countries join, 8 countries from Central Eastern Europe, and we have a tension towards less regulation. We have a tension where new countries, new governments wanted to have less social Europe and more European funds. And the idea was we can access the funds and we can make good use of the funds, Cohesion Fund, European Regional Development Fund, if we do not change our social regulations, because we're more competitive, we can support growth more powerfully, and therefore there was this trend that was a combination of let's call it less willingness in the governments of the old European Union, and no willingness at all in the governments that had just joined in terms of supporting social Europe. And 2004 is the year when the Barroso Commission starts for 10 years, and it will be a gradual fall of open method of coordination. And today, I'm not sure that you already took a look at the documents of the European semester, but if you take a look at the documents that on a yearly basis are produced, you will see that there's a reference to employment. But this reference is very limited, and you don't have direct reference to any other of the social policies we're focusing on, unless you have references that are going towards budget maintenance or budget support. So they're asking you to do cuts in pensions, so you may have sentences such as the pension system is unsustainable, the pension system is inadequate to what? Of course, to public finance. So it's totally residual and totally subdued to other goals, which are economic and financial, especially if you are within the Eurozone. So we had the end of what we had known until that moment. Finally, if we look at what actually, so on the one hand, just to make this clearer, on the one hand, we have less and less regulation in terms of policy provisions. And on the other hand, we have increasing regulation in terms of austerity. I don't think that anything such as what happened in Greece happened in Lithuania, because it was not that worrisome as a situation. But as you may recall, maybe not recall because you were very young at the time, most of you were very young at the time, but some of you recall and some of you maybe have read or have seen some pictures. Well, for Greece, austerity measures meant a social crisis that is yet to be fully recovered from. But we could continue, especially Cyprus had a big crisis, Ireland to a certain extent, Portugal and Spain a bit less, but still Italy as well. Here we have those countries that actually had to go through a memorandum of understanding with the European Commission and the so-called Troika, not only the European Commission, but also the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, in order to have a package of support. But our austerity package, so it was very conditioned. We had a number of conditions that were not in favor of social Europe, but were in favor of cutting social provisions at the national level. So, to conclude on the decline of social Europe. On the one hand, we have the end of the open method of coordination and the centrality of some social policies within the European Union policy package. On the other hand, we have the development of a multi-level austerity package that goes even more in the direction of not providing a chance to social policies to be developed. Okay, so here within the social provisions of the austerity package, we had, for example, cutting pensions benefit, making activation even more relevant, cutting healthcare or revising healthcare expenditure. So it really meant not going in a social Europe direction. Now we come to the last part, which is trying to explain all this. So the picture we try to share is a picture where you have less and less social policy provisions at the European Union level, increasing obligations coming from Europe and directed at the national level to tight budgets. And for example, in the Italian case, the balance of budgets was included in the constitution due to the austerity package and all the various measures that were connected to the six-pack and the other pacts that we briefly mentioned here. So how was it possible? We said, well, if we take a look at the political system and we said that we have more demand for social policy, why on earth did the story go in a completely different direction? So we get some mystery here once again. We try to get some mystery here. And we have parts of the answer if we focused on the original mismatch between the demand for social policy and European election results. Now, the preliminary question I have for you, why could we think of seeing a mismatch in these two apparently paired phenomena? Demand for social policy, European electoral results. We would expect them to be connected, right? Am I wrong? But they're not. Why not? Down, 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 down. This is why they're not. Turnout, and already was low in 1979. 2019 it went up, but this is after the story I'm telling you. It's the von der Leyen story. 42-61. So only 4 out of 10 of those who are polled by the Eurobarometer actually do vote. You see the original mismatch? That's where it comes from, because if we take Eurobarometer data, we have data that regard the population, the entire political community. But then only 4 out of 10 vote. And therefore, within those 4 out of 10, priorities are given to other issues. So we could say that most of them, and this is true also for other elections, for example, in the United States, and this is very relevant for social policy, if you take a political perspective, some of the most deprived in society are highly likely not to vote. And this is really a dilemma for social policy, because if you are social policy fans and I all think that we are in this room, otherwise we will not be studying social policy from a normative perspective. But if you want more social policy and you do not have a demand coming not from the people, so to speak, from the electorate, but from the voters, because the voters are not the ones that want more social policy, but they want security, they want stability, they want less migrants, because they see it as a threat. Well, in that case, there's a mismatch between societal needs and demands and political decision making. And in Europe, it's even more visible than in many other countries. Why? Because we have only we had only 4 out of 10 that actually did vote. So for this reason, there was no room for the systemic explanation. There's a very limited direct link between the preferences of EU citizens and actually what happened in terms of turnout. So unfortunately for me, because this was my first preferred hypothesis in a very naive way, I said, well, we need to see something. And of course, I knew about the electoral voters turnout, but I didn't really pay that much attention at the beginning. And this is the wonderful aspect of peer research, because you do have testing hypotheses, and you may not have the ones you prefer. The other one, party-based bureaucratic politics, changing ideological composition of EU commissioners. Here we have something interesting, which actually is connected to the main explanation, which is intergovernmentalist in this case. What do we have? If you focus on the colors, here again drawing primarily on work by Miriam Hartlap. You may wonder, what did I do for this article? I did something. I absolutely swear I did, but I always like to give the credits to the people I work with, because I'm also very privileged to work with such people, and sometimes really they do lots of the work or parts of the work, and I enjoy very much to bring this up all the time. It's not only my work. One of the nicest things of working in academia is doing collective work. So here she collected all the data together with her working group for the various commissions. Here you have all the presidents of the commission. Juncker was the last president before von der Leyen. And what do we see? We see the components. The green are the liberals, the black European People's Party, and the red are the socialists and the Democrats within the European Union. And again, these are the families, party families within the European Parliament. So what do we see? This is Jacques Delors. Remember, we were referring to him yesterday and also earlier today, who actually was president for 10 years until 1995. And as you see, he had, there were also some independent and some greens that came in, but these are very residual. These are the commissioners and their party affiliations, okay? So we're not focusing on the European Parliament. These are not results of the European Parliament. These are the party affiliations of the commissioners that have been somehow calculated or assigned, the party affiliations, focusing on the biographies of the commissioners. Because sometimes it's not that clear cut, okay? So this has been done for all the commissions, and here we have a very powerful majority, especially between 1985 and 1995, that was connecting the European People's Party and therefore the social Christian democratic tradition with the socialists and the Democrats. And the liberals had a residual power. If we look at what happened with the Barroso Commission, just look at the share of power, quote unquote, that goes in the hands of the liberals. So yes, we still have more or less the same majorities, but here we also have independents. So it's not a clear-cut majority. Actually, within the commission, you have, for the first time, less power in the hands of the Socialists and Democrats and the European People's Party. And again, the composition was different for von der Leyen. This is why we went towards the eco-social tradition. But we have some good, we thought in the article, and we still think, I would argue, that actually here we have some explanatory potential. The point is that the commission, which changed, especially during the crisis period, that is 2009, 2012, was constantly put under pressure by the Council of Europe on the one hand, and by the Council of Ministers on the other. As you know, the Concilium is the combination of the two. And what do we have here? Therefore, we have another indicator which says the number of meetings of the European Council. Now, this is a bit technical, but it's very important to know, especially because we're going to all be voters, hopefully, I think, in a few months. So the European Council is the most political institution of the European Union. That's where decisions are not formally adopted, but where the agenda is set and where the main guidelines for policy formulation and then adoptions are taken. Okay? And what do we see? We see that the European Council was informally launched in 1975. It didn't exist before. Informally launched, and then it was put into the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. So here we have, at the beginning, we had 2.5 meetings between 1975 and 1992, because on some occasions, usually there were 2 meetings, one per semester, because the idea was that you had a meeting at the beginning of the European semester, that, as you know, it's a rotating semester, and therefore you had 2, and then you had in the second half of the 80s, especially during 1989, you had a bit more. So, but the average was very close to 2. Okay? So, just think it in very practical terms. You have one council every 6 months, and then most of the job is done by the European Commission in collaboration with the Council of Ministers. Okay? So you are somehow freer. But then, and it remained, it became a bit higher, but it didn't go that high. Then you had almost 6 meetings between 2010 and 2016 per year. This means that every 2 months you had the European Commission banging on your door saying, okay, you have to follow our guidelines. So you had a straitjacket that was put on the European Commission, much more powerful than ever. This is why we can consider this intergovernmentalist explanation as a very powerful one. But a footnote here is that this intergovernmentalism was not similar to the one that led European integration until 1992. Classic intergovernmentalism is France and Germany, at least. Intergovernmentalism is among various governments that have a similar amount of bargaining power. And France and Germany actually were the ones that had this bargaining power. But if we take the 2009, 2010, 2015 period, what do we see? We see asymmetrical intergovernmentalism. Why asymmetrical? Because you have Germany. France is not there for a number of reasons. And other countries are not that powerful. And the UK was just already thinking about going away. So we have an intergovernmentalist explanation, which is a bit different from the classic explanations. It's an asymmetrical intergovernmentalist explanation connected to the empowerment of the European Commission in those fields that were particularly relevant for Germany. Now, as you may have read in the recent times, Germany and Merkel and others said austerity was not a good idea. 10 years later. Okay, it's good to know, but at the time it was very powerfully supported, not simply by Merkel, but by German elites that were also somehow, and by the interpretation of German government of what the German voters wanted. That's where the electoral explanation counts a lot at the national level, not at the European Union one. So you had this hostility towards Southern Europe, for example, and you had a number of anecdotal evidence that was captured by cameras saying, the Greek, they're just partying all the time. The Italians, pizza, mandolino, and whatever, that's what they do. So we have to punish them because they're taking away our money. They're using our money to go on holiday, which may be sometimes the case, but on a systemic reading of reality, it's completely false. Nevertheless, these arguments were put into the bargaining, and the idea was you have to comply, you have to do your homework. This was one of the key sentences. And actually, several prime ministers, or at least some prime ministers, followed this. Monti, the prime minister that Italy had between 2011 and 2013 before the elections, actually was doing the homework, and he supported, and the parliament actually voted for the inclusion in the constitution of the fiscal budget balance, or the budgeting balance. So with this respect, we had answers from countries, but the main driver was asymmetrical intergovernmentalism. So Germany managing to get the support of other governments within the European Council and then the Council of Ministers sitting. So if this story is convincing, we should have everybody thinking that actually until 2017, Europe was not existing anymore. It was killed to a certain extent. We had some debate in the literature. We have some other scholars who had a more positive view of the situation. Jonathan Zeitlin, for example, that is now in Italy, at the time was working in Amsterdam, and others. They said, hey, wait a minute. We're having a number of things. We have social investment, we have European semester, and then we had also a reflection paper on social dimension of Europe that was going in the direction of the European pillar of social rights, the European social rights pillar. So yes, we do have a few elements that could be taken into account, but if we look at them one by one, the European semester, as you know, yearly cycle of economic policy coordination, but it does not have the same centrality than the OMC EMPL, OMC INCL, that are the national action plans that were required by the European Commission. At the time, it was much more relevant in terms of policy coordination. Now, as we said before, it's very residual. Social investment package, well, it's not about developing social policy, but it's rather saying how at the national level social policy should be oriented in terms of taking away the burden from classic welfare and putting it more on childcare, to put it very simply. So it's a guideline, but again, it's not supporting more social Europe, but it's redesigning social Europe in a very restrictive way. The European social pillar, the social rights pillar, was clearly the moment that got me saying in my yearly course, okay, we have to continue with social Europe because something is happening. And in the other article with Beatrice Carrella, we show how that momentum actually gave birth to some new initiatives that then Ursula von der Leyen translated into the eco-social perspective. So, to conclude, we have an explanation of the decline of social Europe, which is not the end until the second half of the tens of 2000s. And the understanding, the description and explanation is very much connected to asymmetrical intergovernmentalism and the changing political orientation of the European Commission. So we have the connection, just like it always happened in the European Union, between the governments and the Commission. But here we have a clear dominant actor, which is the European Council, and within the European Council, Germany. And as a matter of fact, in the literature, we have also other findings on other policies that talk about new intergovernmentalism. What is the new intergovernmentalism? An intergovernmentalism which is asymmetrical, that is primarily led by the German government within the European institutions where governments actually have a representation. So party-based and party-based bureaucratic politics in connection to intergovernmentalism or symmetrical intergovernmentalism, in my view, in our view, explains the story very, very well. The systemic understanding or the systemic explanation simply does not hold. So this mismatch, remember we started with our question, why is it that it didn't happen? Simply because we do not have yet, at least, a political system that is working from an electoral perspective exactly as the domestic political systems are. So yes, we have politicization, which is increasingly relevant. As we said yesterday, Ursula von der Leyen had to focus very much on the support which was within the European institutions and was also in society, but it was not looking that much at the elections. The new elections may change partially the story because, as a matter of fact, the Spitzenkandidat issue has become increasingly relevant. With Juncker, it was not an issue because Juncker was nominated. With von der Leyen, as we have seen yesterday, it became quite a crucial aspect to consider. It's very fascinating now to just see what's going to happen in the coming months. And if ever, you will keep in mind what we discussed between yesterday and today so far. Maybe you will manage to disentangle a bit more neatly what may be the triggers for social policy or the obstacles for social policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this in-depth picture of this several decades and a bit of a history of how the European social policy developed. It didn't sound so optimistic, frankly speaking, but okay, let's discuss. We still have some time for questions, not too much, but maybe any questions in the room or comments?
Yeah, we can also start with questions later, as you were suggesting yesterday, so we can.
Yeah, we'll see. Let's see if there is any, and then we can continue.
Maybe you presented the history. Maybe you have some insights about the future, how it will develop, and because there is a big, I don't know, the polls shows that the right-wing populists will quite win a lot of places in Europe Parliament. So how it will make impact on the social Europe. Yeah.
Right. Let me see if we can together try to answer to the question, if I manage to do so. So we should have the EU election poll of polls, which should be the Politico. And there should be, sorry, this is not connected yet. We have some updated surveys that actually do say, as you were suggesting, that we may have a slight increase in the Eurosceptic component of the European Parliament. And this clearly could be not that good for the development of a layer of social protection at the European level. Let's see if we can. Okay. I'm sure you all know this website, by the way. If not, it's very useful to be kept informed about European Union and domestic politics, because you have information, see May 12th presidential election in Lithuania, for example, but you do not need this website for this type of information, but for other types of information, maybe you do, or you could be interested. So let's check the latest polls regarding the European Parliament. Let's see what's the format. Okay, so this is, oh, you cannot see properly. I think I'll have to reduce this a bit, yes. Okay, now you should, no. Uh-oh, it's not me. Yeah, I know. Oh, brilliant, yeah, that's wonderful.
I don't know if it's wonderful, but
It's wonderful if it works, of course.
yeah, maybe this is better. I don't know.
It is wonderful, as a matter of fact. So, here you have the results, or the possible results. So, EPP, European People's Party, and Socialists and Democrats. Together, they're not having the majority. So, here are the other. You have the identity, the far right, so to speak. You have the conservatives. You have Renew Europe, the liberals. And then you have even more radical right or independent, Greens, non-affiliated, and left. So, if you think about it, you could have EPP, Socialists and Democrats, Greens, and far left. This would be the best, in my view, talking about what things may happen, this could be the best option for social policy. But the left, far left, actually never was part of the European Commission or the European Parliament majority, as we have seen. So the most probable, the most likely could be EPP, Socialists and Democrats, and the Greens. But it's really a it barely is a majority. So the discussion is, let's get on board also the ECR. If this happens, there's a constraint towards the development of more regulation, especially on social policy at the European level. So if these polls are confirmed in the elections, then I would see no real push towards more social policy at the European Union level. If ever the Greens succeed a bit more, and there's a political decision that will not happen, to include also the left party, then it could be that you go in that direction. But nobody has really talked about that yet. So it's highly likely that we will have Ursula von der Leyen II coalition. As you know, it has been called the Coalition Ursula, right? So it's a huge, relatively big coalition that is supporting Ursula von der Leyen. And what will be the card that is going to be played in order to keep unity? For the moment, it looks like the card is going to be the European Union defense, that is mobilizing over other topics. And of course, this could generate a public expenditure, but not social public expenditure, because it goes in another direction. So it's not wanting to be pessimistic, so to speak, but it's being very realistic in terms of translating the orientations into votes and transforming the votes into the government of the European Union. The next 6 months are going to be crucial exactly because we need to know if the next 5 years will be a growing European Union that will try to play a common defense card, which is very complicated, but you have, this is not an endogenous critical juncture, this is an exogenous classic critical juncture of war. And war may trigger changes that do not directly go into the expansion of social policy provisions, but on the expansion of the defense capacities of the European Union.
Okay, I think that all this issue that you mentioned, and I'm very happy that you raised it about the defense and common defense and expenditures that could potentially go into it, and also defer somewhat, to some extent, the social spending in this sphere. I think it's both on the EU level and also, especially in our region, it's this big elephant in the room, also on the national level. But I think that we now need to make a break. And after the break, we can start with some remaining questions, if there are any. So think of the question that you would like to ask. This might be directly related or more general. I think that Paula can answer this. Okay, thank you very much. And
Thank you.
see you all after the break. So, welcome back. So now we have the final stretch of Paolo's lectures, and it will be on the comparative approach to explaining the welfare state development. As you said, more classical approach, yes. So if the first bit, hopefully it was interesting, but also might have been a bit challenging, yes. This one would be maybe something as well that you're more used to. So please.
Thank you very much indeed. I didn't realize putting together the sessions that we would have had at 9 a.m. in the morning, the toughest lecture. So thank you for bearing with me, and I hope it wasn't too complex. By the way, if there is any question regarding...
yes, exactly.
Yeah. So,
I promise that I'll take some questions.
Right, if ever there's anything that you would like to go back to with reference to the first, or you just want to forget about it and make sure that you can move on. Right, yeah, because we were just a reflection I'd like to share. We were just thinking how important it is to contextualize social policy also within the European framework. You may not be interested in European policy that much, but even if you focus on social policy at the local level, having the framework, the European framework, helps a lot, because some constraints or some opportunities, just think about the European Social Fund. The European Social Fund is the main financial instrument that feeds in social policy, also at the local level. I'm sure you're all familiar with vocational training and a number of initiatives that are funded locally by the European Social Fund. And clearly the function of the European Social Fund is connected to the developments that we may find at the European Union level. So even if you're not that interested in the European Union level, having the chance to put social policy in a European perspective or in a multi-level perspective can help you better single out the various elements that then make up social policy that you are maybe interested in.
Yeah. And yes, thank you very much. I forgot about the question that I promised that I can also take several if there are any. After the break, maybe you had some reflection and some questions that are still left. You can also ask in Lithuanian, and I can translate.
Of course.
Yesterday I thought that it could be also an option. Anything? Okay. I actually have some questions. Yeah. I can start and okay. Yeah, that's better. So I actually have several questions, and so first was you very well mentioned about this asymmetric intergovernmentalism. So the fact that there are different governments and different countries that are in the EU, but some of them have more influence than others. And I think for sure Merkel and that during that period that you discussed was really a prominent figure, and probably for several reasons that you mentioned and some that were not mentioned, then it was really very much asymmetric towards Germany. So do you now see that this asymmetry is becoming more symmetric, so that other countries, for example, I know France is back into the game, or like other governments, and also, I don't know, we're here in Lithuania, so this is a very small country within the EU, but well, it also forms coalitions with other countries, and during like this, you made these periods, yes, and your first period ended 2004 of the enlargement. There was also a change in the commission that you showed, but also what is the influence of our region, I would say, maybe not just Lithuania, but our region or the new countries, because these are Euro-optimistic, probably, countries that replaced Italy as Euro-optimists.
Yeah.
Yeah, so how do you see the symmetry and asymmetry currently?
So I'll take the two questions. The first I can answer a bit more properly. The second I'm not so sure, but I'll try to at least have share some reflections. The first regards indeed the asymmetric intergovernmentalism that is slightly changing for two reasons. One, Macron, as you know, is trying to play the European card much more powerfully. Now, we don't have the polls of polls, but we had Renew Europe, which actually has become Macron's, quote-unquote, European political party, if you wish. So with this respect, we have a very powerful comeback. The limitation of this, though, is that Macron is powerful in terms of negotiating and bargaining, but he's not supported by the socialists and Democrats as other leaders were in the past. So there's a mismatch, a French mismatch. On the one hand, there's this new capacity to try to play the European card, and you may have followed European affairs. He organized a big conference on Europe. He's trying really to use Europe also because Macron is very young and he's going to finish soon his second term, and he has to find something to do. So Europe may be quite understandably the place where he wants to continue with his political career. So, I mean, beyond the speculations, the point is that we have France much more politically back than in the past. Both Sarkozy and Hollande, for different reasons, were not as powerful as the previous French presidencies. And therefore, thanks to Macron, since 2017, we had a different momentum. But at the same time, as we have seen, Renew Europe is not the party, the second or the first party, so it's a third, fourth, and of course it will be part of the next majority, and therefore it will play some cards that may be also successful. But France is not that powerful as it used to be when Delors was there, for example, because there you had a French president of the Commission that was supported also by the French government. So it was much more, it was still symmetrical, but it was slightly asymmetrical with reference to French power back in that days, 1985, 1995. So today we have a comeback, a limited comeback of France on the one hand. On the other hand, we have Germany that does not have Merkel anymore, which is quite obvious. But the consequence of this is that we do not have, for a number of reasons, that leadership capacity. And therefore Germany, the government of Germany is much less powerful than it used to be. So indeed, the asymmetries are being slightly readdressed. And this is, I think, why the European elections are going to be so important to somehow try to evaluate if some asymmetries may continue, or even we may have other asymmetries that go in other directions. So going to the second question, again, I'm not an expert on the Baltic preferences, but the more I will come to Vilnius and we'll reinforce exchanges, the more I will become one, hopefully. So I will maybe answer this question more properly in one of the next times we will meet. But surely the enlargement was very much a Polish story in terms of influence, simply because Poland is a big state, and simply because Poland managed to obtain a number of funds and play a very important political role for obvious reasons. Today, as you know, the Polish government went back to a more Euro-supportive stance. So it's possible that together with Poland, also the way I see it, but then I'd like to know you, what do you think? The reorientation of Poland could also support Baltic preferences in terms of getting more voice in Europe, more voice with reference to the decisions, not simply in terms of representation. So I think that if the European elections go more or less as we have seen, even if we have the Green Party in the government, you may have more voice as a Poland plus Baltic states group, because as you know, the other country which has been problematic for the European Union beyond Poland until the change of government is Hungary. And of course, Hungary is going in another direction, but we could see Hungary increasingly isolated, and this for the European Union could be positive, and therefore it could leave more room for maneuver for also the Baltic states. Of course, the Ukrainian war creates a number of challenges, but these challenges can be common and can be seen as common, so you can have even more teaming up in the near future.
Okay, so now I think we should give some time
Yeah.
for this new topic, so let's just proceed.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. So fourth and last lecture here, I do think that I'm going to go back to some of the knowledge you already have. So I'm not going to speak that much about globalization and pressures on the welfare state, but it's going to be one of the factors that we're going to focus on in terms of challenges and developments. So what we're going to do in this hour or so that we have together, I'd like to once again leave at least 15 minutes, because it's going to be the last session, and you will be wide awake by 12, and so I'm sure that on these topics in particular you'll have many questions and comments. Once again, comments and observations in Lithuanian, not because I can understand it, but because very kindly someone will translate it for me. So feel more than free also to interrupt me during the lecture if you have any questions or so. So we'll briefly focus on welfare state developments. We will look at common challenges, but before we do that, looking at the more recent times, we will also look at historical developments. And here we will compare European countries with Latin American countries. Why Latin America? Because Latin America, together with Europe, and with the exception of Australia and United States, that of course had welfare state developments, is the continent that had most important developments in, let's call it the global south countries. So clearly North America, Europe, and Australia are the ones, the continents where you had developments of welfare state, but Latin America in the global south is increasingly relevant for policy developments, in particular in the past 20 years. As we will see, there's expansion in Latin America, where in Europe we had retrenchment rather than expansion. So we'll focus a bit on how things developed over time and why they developed as they developed. Then we'll look at internal and external pressures that over the past 20 years have been challenging the functioning of European and also other welfare states. And then we'll try somehow to understand what have been the answers provided by the various countries. And here, I really very much would like to hear the Lithuanian story from you in terms of opportunities, challenges, and tensions that still may be out there in terms of welfare state development. So if we take Europe in a nutshell, you have much more information in the article, but again, since we do not have that much time, and I really would like to have some discussion over this, we'll focus on the key elements. As you know, we do not need to refer to Bismarck necessarily, but clearly Bismarck was one of the prominent figures in supporting the emergence of the welfare state. So if comparatively we also look at Denmark, we also look at Sweden, we also look at other countries, at France, the end of the 19th century and early 20th century is the period when you have emergence. And again, a footnote, writing this article some years ago, I really enjoyed very much going back to the classics of social policy. So Klaus Offe and of course Paul Pearson and many others that actually went back to, or Baldwin. They looked at the history of welfare state, and this was fascinating because today we are
used to focusing on current policy developments. But if you go to the past, you really understand the strength and the power of something that was completely new. We take for granted welfare state, but these times, if you worked before Bismarck and before other policymakers, if you were working, you were injured, you were in deep trouble. And for us today, even if you are in a not so well-developed welfare state, if you have a regular contract, that's an issue, of course, then you have social protection. At the time, it was something very bold to imagine. So again, just sharing this a wonder that I enjoyed very much reading and getting into the details of some countries that I really did not know much of at the time. Though, then you have 1920s and 40s, after World War I, you have a trend towards consolidation in a number of countries. Then, of course, you have a troubled decade that then evolves into the so-called Trente Glorieuses that we were referring to yesterday, the golden age of welfare state development, when you have expansion on a continental scale within, of course, Western Europe in particular. But again, I was just asking yesterday, how can we position the former Soviet Union or the other countries that were within the Soviet Union or were connected to the Soviet Union? Statistics, we do not really have them, or at least we cannot rely that much on statistics. So yes, there was coverage, but we do not exactly know what type of a coverage it is. So my caveat here is that when we focus on the European experience, unfortunately, we focus primarily on those countries that actually had statistics that we can rely upon. So we are typically focusing on Western Europe. I think it would be fascinating, maybe it has already been done, it would be fascinating to go back and trace also the historical developments if you had some good data, because again, someone could argue we had a wonderful welfare state at the time because everybody had employment, for example. Again, I don't want to be provocative here, but this is a point that comes up from time to time, saying, well, until 1991, we had no unemployment. Is it true? Is it not true? Again, I think having solid social policy research, also ethnographic research, just think about the fact that now you still could interview people that were very much into that system and you could have evidence. So it would be a fascinating research topic, but this is for you rather than for me. Then after the expansion, starting with the 80s in particular, Margaret Thatcher, I'm sure you all know her name. You had this idea that society does not exist. For social policy scholars, this is a blasphemy, of course, and I think that it's very difficult to believe. But the idea was, let's go back to the individual. Let's go back to private companies. Let's go back to different worlds that are not covered by the state. The state becomes, to a certain extent, the enemy. So from welfare state is to opportunities that are provided to individuals. If they do not pick them up, it's their problem. And this is not only in the United Kingdom, but it is progressively in many other countries, and it continues until very recent times in many, many countries. In particular, what we have, though, is the activation turn, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the term. So you have this focusing on employment policy, for example. You have this trend or this move from welfare to workfare, as it has been labeled in very simplistic ways, but I think it's sufficiently accurate to tell us about the European story. COVID-19, of course, produced some challenges, some opportunities, some expansion in coverage with reference, for example, to healthcare, but we still have to see if some of the changes are going to be permanent or not. For example, if we take the European Union, I'd not even mentioned it, we had some very conjunctural provisions, such as the reinsurance mechanism that goes under the name of SURE. Well, it was not carried on after the crisis, so basically it was a conjunctural change that didn't last over time. So I just left a question mark here because we cannot really say much about this new period. For sure, we have 20, 25-year, 30-year maximum expansion between the end of the 40s and the 70s. And then we had 40 years of retrenchment under various forms with various intensity. But for sure, even those attempts that we saw the European Union did not really succeed that much. We have a revamping set of attempts at the European Union level now. We were just talking about, for example, the minimum wage directive together with some others. But clearly, we are still in the making of something that still remains residual. As we said, social policy, welfare states remain at the national level. And also the directive, if you read the directive, just a footnote, because we were discussing this earlier. If you read the directive, it's a peculiar directive because it sets a goal, just like all the directives, it sets a goal, but it does not identify the compulsory means that have to be used in order to reach the goal. So how has it been interpreted? Of course, some has said governments have to rule. But in the Italian case, where we have no minimum wage, the answer has been, we're going to discuss it, but it's going to be negotiated by the unions and business associations. So we're going to set some guidelines, because it's controversial, and then we'll leave it to them. So at the end, you may not have a domestic legislation that actually goes in the direction of setting the minimum wage. The €9, this would be the Italian case minimum wage, which is a proposal coming from the opposition. So just to go back to this, we have a question mark also for the European Union with this respect. We will again see what happens in the future. Latin America. I don't know how familiar you are with the developments of Latin America. I wasn't, and I'm still am not an expert on Latin America, but I was intrigued by the study thanks to a conference that actually happened in one Latin American country, and we had some dialogues we had some discussions with colleagues coming from that part of the world. So together with Matteo Jesula, my other co-author in this case, with whom I developed this paper and this argument, we said, okay, let's try to see if there are parallel developments or not, and if so, if they're not parallel, why? Of course, we have late 19th century, early 20th century in Latin America. It was a moment when we were moving in another direction that was not the development of social policy, but was the development of democracies. This is a moment when democracies in Europe were still in a very initial phase, but virtually we had none in Latin America. So we didn't not even have attempts to go towards that direction. Well, we only had them between early 20th century and the first half of the 20th century, when, not surprisingly, we have welfare states. As you know, welfare states develop very much with democracy expansion, because, as we said yesterday, as you know already, welfare states develop as a consequence of expansion of rights. And social rights, T.H. Marshall, you all read, I'm sure, the classic or have referred to it, talks about also social rights together with civil and political rights. Then we have, after emergence, consolidation, and 2 decades of retrenchment. This is the global retrenchment period that we find, the neoliberal retrenchment, we can label it, period throughout the world, and Latin America to a certain extent even more so, in some countries in particular, where we had democratic backsliding in some cases. So not only did we have retrenchment of the welfare state, but we had de-democratization in a number of occasions. And then we have this period, which is the most recent one, where, with some exceptions, we had an expansion, many new left-wing governments coming in that went much more for universalism. So it's not only expansion of welfare state, but it's in particular an expansion of a universalistic conception of welfare state. And we had it in a number of Latin American countries. So we could really focus on several of them. Then, towards the end of the decade, of the past decade, we had some changes in government. Bolsonaro in Brazil, for example, that turned back to less welfare state. On the contrary, Lula, just to mention one country, quite an important one, Brazil, you had an expansion of La Bolsa Familia and a number of policy provisions that were expansionary and were covering many more people than were ever covered before. So we had expansion, but in some countries towards the end we had some changes. But altogether, once again, if we take a more global assessment, we still had expansion in the Latin American experience with, we could label it an inclusive turn. You had universal and more inclusive policies that were at the heart of the policy developments. Let's keep a question mark here as well, because again, we still do not know what exactly is happening in this period. How do we explain the differences or the main features of the various policy areas and the various countries? Well, here we are somehow going back to classic explanations that I'm sure you're very, very familiar with. So, very broadly speaking, socioeconomic factors, the logic of industrialism or post-industrialism, right? So you have challenges that come from industrialization, and these trigger societal demands for welfare state provision. Again, going back to the 1880s and that decade, you had, on the one hand, workers that were organizing and turning into social movements or trade unions, or you had businesses that were scared about revolutionary claims. So there was a push towards change in the provision of policies, in particular a push towards expansion of policies in the social field. Political factors. Here, remember, you may recall, for those who were here yesterday, we had the article by Jan Guff, and we had interests, ideas, and institutions. Here, we put together interests and ideas in the political factors, in particular under the form of the power resource theory. I'm sure you have heard of the power resource theory. Am I correct? Maybe not. I'm wrong?
The bachelor students, second, third year should have heard.
So now it's time to fully wake up, because you have the support of your professors, so you must answer this time. What is the power resource theory? You may not like it. You may not be convinced, by the way. Let's always keep our good critical spirit here. So you may say, it's nonsense. But first of all, you need to know about it in order to criticize it. Okay. I guess you're only too shy. I'm sure you know. But I'll try somehow to expand it in English. So you know it in Lithuanian maybe, and you don't think you know it in English. Of course you do. But anyway, the political factors were primarily focusing on trade unions. So power resource theory, or political factors to put it more simplistically, saw in the expansion of social movement or in the expansion of trade unions a push towards the expansion of the welfare state. Together, and more recently, together with trade unions, we had also the socialist or socialist democratic parties that were included in this push. So the idea is that the more power trade unions and socialist or social democratic party have, the more probable it will be for a welfare state to develop. Okay? This is why, as you know, a theory always has to have a causation mechanism, otherwise it's not a theory. So here, the idea is that the greater the power, the greater you will have developments in social policy. And finally, those institutional factors, here you have institutional legacies of constraints or even of opportunities. For example, policy developments that were there before, or, and this is for us particularly relevant, exogenous factors. On the one hand, globalization, on the other hand, Europeanization. Global, for example, the so-called structural constraints that were posed by the World Bank in Latin America in the 80s, and in Europe, the conditionality provided by the European Union institutions with reference to, for example, taking part to the Eurozone or not, or today with reference to the national resilience and recovery plans, right? And here, let me show you the table that you'll find in the paper. It should be, yeah, here it is, or maybe here it is. Okay, I'll have to just, yeah. So this is the European story. Can you see all right, also in the back? Yeah. So I'll just make it maybe a bit. Okay, perfect. So this is the European story. What did we do together with my colleague? We looked at secondary literature, so we didn't conduct original research. It's impossible to do if you want to cover 2 continents. You have to trust. Here we were very ambitious. Actually, it never turned out in a fully fledged paper for a journal because we needed to work very much more on it. Actually, this is one of those cases where an article is not enough. You really need to write a book if you have time and if you have the resources. So we just had it as a working paper of the LIEP Research Institute at Sciences Po in Paris. And then we didn't really work that much on it, but I was very happy to pick it up and share it with you because I think it's of some interest. If ever you will have time to read it, you will let me know. What we try to do is try to, again, grade the various factors. So very relevant, relevant, poorly relevant, not relevant at all, underlining the intensity of relevance. So we derived the intensity of relevance looking at the literature, the existing literature for these countries. So as you see, socioeconomic is always very important, very relevant in the emergence, expansion, retrenchment, a bit less in consolidation because here we have the political factors which are very important. Institutional, not yet, because here you have very limited legacies. You have very limited institutional constraints, so it's not surprising. But if you look at constraints, then you have sometimes the exogenous pressures or you have institutional pressures that are posing some constraints that cannot be politically played out that easily. This is where you have the blame avoidance strategy. So you say, I need to retrench, and of course you have to do it because you're within the government, but you may have also opposition, and you have constraints coming from the socioeconomic dimension and institutional one. So in a nutshell, the market, or how the market is understood and played on the one hand, and institutions both within the country and increasingly outside the country in terms of institutional determinants. Any question with this respect before we move to the Latin American experience?
For the Latin America, you will also have a similar one?
Yeah, exactly. We will have a very similar table. So this is a systematic comparison, but we have some differences. This is why we think that the comparison could be of some promise. So institutional in retrenchment is the same. You have socioeconomic less because you have less constraints and less opportunities, and you have lots of politics going on over there. So especially for the expansion, you have even more political triggers than you did in the European experience. So what do we learn from this? What we could learn is that even though you may have some powerful institutional constraints that actually do continue, let's just remember that the expansion period was 2000-2020. Okay? So, and it came after 20 years of retrenchment, 80s, 2000s. Where the institutional constraints, also external, World Bank, the so-called Washington Consensus, was very powerful in not imposing, because at the end the governments were there accepting the structural adjustment. This is how it was called. But then you had change in government, and you had the socialist or social democratic parties becoming relevant. It actually did change very much the picture. And notwithstanding the constraints that remained to a certain extent, were capable of pushing welfare state developments much further. So, yes, sure, please.
Because with Latin America, you mentioned it quite clearly that, especially for retrenchment, the institutional factor, the Washington consensus, the role of World Bank, and also IMF to some extent, was really very important. But in the European context, I would guess that the political factors for the retrenchment would be more prominent. So maybe I misunderstand.
No.
Institutional and what is
No. You got it. The political, though, if you take the European experience, you're taking the European Union. This is where Europeanization was very powerful in terms of using the socioeconomic constraints in order to also condition. Just think about what we saw before in terms of the austerity package. It was, of course, implemented, but it was supported very much by the institutions that were not domestic. Let's always remember that the welfare state development, here we're focusing at the national level. So institutional factors such as the European Union is seen as an exogenous pressure. So for this reason, the Washington consensus in Latin America becomes the austerity package and the activation and the Barroso legacy, so to speak, after 2004. For this reason, it's a similar intensity, and there's less room for maneuver, even less, because if you think about the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, they were not part of a Latin American Union that was inbuilt into the domestic political system. So you could say no, for example, to paying back the debts. This is also what Mexico did at a certain point. You could, in Argentina, you want to restructure the debt. If you do it in Europe, you're not going to get European funds. You're going to be penalized because it's much more stringent. This is where the comparison, this is a broader point, this is where comparison becomes very important, because we see Europe, we said social Europe, and altogether the European Union may not be that binding. It's much more binding than a continent where you do not have a Latin American Union. You see what I mean? So with this respect, these were very powerful constraints. Any observations or criticism on your part? Maybe I have a Latin American expert without knowing it. Not yet. Maybe in the near future. So if this makes any sense, then we can continue with reference to understanding the challenges. Again, going back to the classic potential killer. So what? Why shall we care? Why do we care? Not only because it's, I think, intellectually stimulating, but also because we're trying to go beyond much of the literature that is very much focusing on Europe and European developments. Welfare state, social policy in Europe has developed enormously, but if you want to generalize social science findings and if you want to somehow broaden the theories, you need to have as many cases as possible. So if you add to the European, the US and Canadian and Australian experience, very important continents such as Latin America, and then you move forward to Asian countries and possibly to African countries, you may have a theory of global welfare state development, which could be very, very interesting. So this is why I think it matters. And it also matters because it tells us a bit about policy transfer and how policy ideas may travel from one continent to the other. So some scholars that were working on the austerity package said, hey, this is completely similar to the structural adjustment mechanisms that we had in Latin America. And therefore, focusing on the exogenous pressures, in both cases, we had two factors going on. One was globalization, and the European version in this view of globalization was Europeanization. So as we will see, initially Europeanization was also seen as a variant of globalization. I will argue that Europeanization is also social Europe, so it's something different. But clearly there were moments when globalization equaled to Europeanization. So the austerity package equaled the structural adjustment. And therefore, we understand at the global level how some ideas and some interests may push in one direction or the other. So the final part of I'm starting to collapse after 8 hours. Yeah, so if I really fall, please don't worry, it's just natural after these very intense and wonderful lectures. I wanted to look with you the various pressures that are at place and have been at place over the past years, and this leads directly to the Lithuanian experience, where I really would like to learn from you in the final 15-20 minutes, together with comments and issues. I'd like you to think about Lithuania in this picture, and then you tell me what were the factors at play for developments and in which direction they went for Lithuania. Globalization, Europeanization on the one hand, and then endogenous pressures. Here I'm building on work you may be very familiar with, Paul Pearson, The Politics of the Welfare State, and it's a early 2000 or late 90s book, which introduced the notion of permanent austerity before austerity actually was in the policies of the European Union. And we'll see what actually this means. So the idea is that there are specific factors, and I know that for Lithuania, population aging is a crucial element, but again, I want to hear it from you later. Productivity growth slowdown, growth limits, and household restructuring that is also at play. So if we start with globalization, we all know what it is. Actually, you have Sykes, I think, is the author that wrote the book that is in your reference list. So you know what it is. How does it exert potential pressures, especially for old industrial countries? You have increasing competition, not only from China, Vietnam, but also within Europe from the new countries that entered into the European Union, in particular countries that can then have labor force moving from one place to the other. So you have challenges that are supported by, in this specific case, globalization, and it may determine a race to the bottom. At least in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was this fear that globalization would have determined welfare state retrenchment, fear from a social policy prescriptive perspective. And as a matter of fact, in some cases it did happen, in some others it didn't. So it played out in very different ways, but for sure it was a challenge, especially in old European Union. You had this growing challenge of companies that if regulation became too tight, could simply go elsewhere. So the bargaining power of trade unions was lowered substantially because there was an exit option that until that moment was not available. Talking about the exit option, let me ask you if you're familiar with Albert Hirschman. Have you ever, because there's this exit, voice, and loyalty framework, which is absolutely fascinating and wonderful. In case you're interested, you can search it for yourself. And the exit strategy was simply not there before, in Hirschmanian terms. So here, the exit strategy for the companies did actually exert pressures in various welfare states that were connected to globalization. Europeanization, on the one hand, it's a set of supranational institutions that are actually even more strong and powerful than the global ones. So they can set a number of policies that somehow may also support welfare state retrenchment. And especially if you look at a number of the conditions that were put in the austerity package, well, this is what we find. So in some dimensions, Europeanization, globalization are very similar. But if we take a closer look, then we may find some differences that actually lasted over time. Number one, you have a purely negative market orientation of global institutions, whereas you have more nuanced and potentially more towards a positive side direction or orientation of European Union. Now, what does this mean here? We are referring to the work by Fritz Scharpf and others that we're looking at how the global and European setting has been built. If you think about the global institutions, what is their goal? To create a market. So it's negative in the sense that it takes away barriers. It's not negative or positive in normative terms, okay? So it's good or bad. It's negative because it takes away barriers. So it simply eliminates things. Whereas it's positive because it also builds. So yes, we do take away barriers, tariff barriers or non-tariff barriers within the European Union. But at the same time, we also put in the Resilience and Recovery Fund. We also put in the European Social Fund. You don't have a global social fund. Or just to give you a very vivid example. Okay, so with this respect, we also have market making under the form of social policies that will correct the market. So they make the market, but they also correct. So it's market making plus market correcting in Europe. It's only market making in the global system. Okay, then a bit more rapidly, because these are more political science factors that you may be less interested in. Modes of governance, intergovernmental, the global setting, multi-level, the European, and a mode of decision-making, more open or closed with reference to the global setting, more closed, more open, the European Union, at least broadly speaking. So there are differences, but in terms of pressures, we could argue that sometimes the pressures are exactly the same. So this is with reference to the exogenous pressures. About the endogenous pressures. Number one, permanent austerity, as it was labeled by Paul Pearson, currently teaching at Berkeley in the US. Permanent austerity because with reference to the so-called golden age of welfare state, productivity is not as high as it used to be. We are in a post-industrial world, going back to the logic of industrialism or the logic of post-industrialism. So we have a massive and continuous shift in employment from dynamic to less dynamic service provision. So we have less production and more services. Production with high added value, services with relatively low added value. Wages that, comparatively speaking, and in standard purchasing terms, may be lower. And this means, as we were also discussing yesterday with reference to Lithuania, lower taxes, especially if you have a flat rate or you have a quasi-flat rate in terms of taxes. So, lower resources, lower capacities to fund the welfare state, shrinking or retrenching welfare states. This could be the consequence. Okay? Does this make sense? And then you'll tell me if what again, the Lithuanian experience. Welfare state maturation. So, over the years, welfare state did not simply mean protecting injured people on work from not having a chance to make a living. It's not only healthcare, it's not only pensions. Within healthcare, we have many more policy provisions that in some cases can be very costly because you have new cures, you have new methodologies, you have new techniques, but still these techniques, if covered by the state, can cost a lot in terms of public funding. So pensions, healthcare have developed substantially. As we will see, the logic of pension provision changed also in terms of providing a pension also to those who actually never contributed. So it's expanding costs, expanding rights, expanding protection of social rights, which we may be very much be in favor of, but this is not the relevant point. The point is that it costs growingly. So if we take a look at the charts of expenditure, social expenditure over the years, until early 2000s, we have expansion also with this respect. And it's expansion because the rights that were protected expanded, and the policies provided expanded. But if you have such an expansion, and as we said, you have the need to cover, you cannot only use general taxation, in some cases you do not want to do it, but you increase contributions. Again, I'm saying things you know very well. Social insurance, labor cost. And this is connected to globalization. So if you have greater labor cost, you will have companies that will tell you, you know what, I'm just going to Vietnam. I'm just going to China. I'm going to offshore because it's going to be much less expensive. This was some years ago. Now it's maybe not that clear cut also because the labor costs in the world have soared substantially. But again, these were the pressures that we had for over 20 years since mid-90s or so. Population aging. I think I do not need to tell you much about this because it's one of the main issues that regard Lithuania today. It regards also Japan, it regards Italy, it regards a number of European countries. Actually, it's a European phenomenon. It's a global north phenomenon. And here, it's obviously connected, this is obviously connected to welfare state costs. Because to live more, it's wonderful, we're all happy. But who's going to pay for it? If we still fill in the logic of the welfare state, you need funds, you need money, because you're not in a barter economy. Although this is something, again, we could reflect. Why we could be very creative with this respect. Policy menus so far have not been that creative. We'll add some points at the end when we will also, together, we will look at potential solutions to all these pressures and challenges. But clearly, if we take it as a pressure, well, then we need more money. We need to focus on expansion of services. And it's not only about living longer, but it's about trying to make people live longer in a healthier way. So on the one hand, you have costs of pensions. On the other hand, you have healthcare costs. So with all this, the population aging has consequences, substantial consequences, but also social assistance. Just think about elderly that are not living in a family. So not only do you have to cover with a pension, you have to cover with health care, but you also have to provide some support, social assistance support, because they're relatively healthy, but they're not as healthy as they were, so they need some help. That's social assistance, that's extra costs, right? So social public expenditure goes up. Finally, we have this great transformation, to cite Polanyi, another author I'm sure you know. If not, I do encourage you. Hirschman and Polanyi are a must reads if ever you have time. What does it mean, transformation of household structures? Now, this is where Lithuania was already well off in terms of sharing the burden within the families. So this is one of those indicators where we have interesting differences with reference to Central Eastern European countries and in particular Southern European Western countries. In old European Union, we had an increase in women's labor force participation and a willingness to participate in also mobilizing for greater participation. So not only did we have quote-unquote feminist social movements, but we had an increased push coming also from the governments, because at the end you needed more work also in order to pay the bill in the other that were going up due to the other phenomena. We have falling fertility rates, which is connected to aging, and rise in single-parent households. So the so-called male breadwinner model that was at the heart of so many welfare states, as you know, was put into crisis, was not only criticized for understandable reasons, but was also not functional anymore to changes. You don't have the male breadwinner, not the breadwinner. The male wins the bread, right? You don't have the male, but you have female. Maybe single female with 1, 2, 3 kids. So social assistance issues and employment issues come up quite more strongly. So here again, we have not only an increase in costs, but also we have an increase in social policy demands. So one of the consequences of this would be, for example, to have more public childcare. Because if you want to have females that are in the condition of working, you also, and they may not have that much support in the family, or simply there's no other family with the exception of the single mother, then you need public services that will offer the chance for the children to be taken care of while the female worker is in activity. So, as you see, all these pressures are very powerful, and they triggered a number of changes in the policy mixes that are very, very different, but at the same time have generated a varieties of pressures and a varieties of challenges. Not all these pressures and challenges were translated into policy change. So here we have to clearly distinguish between pressures and change. There's nothing automatic. That's where the factors, institutional and political factors, come in, also in this case. So we have very different outcomes. We have varieties of welfare states, and we always had this, we know it. But we also have internal transformations, which are very, very interesting. For example, in Southern Europe, we had changes that made Southern European countries much more different from what they were. Would you have anything to add? Yeah, because as I often say, I'm in favor of socialization of information and against privatization of information. So in case you want to socialize what you were talking about, that would be greatly appreciated. If it was too personal, then don't worry. And now it's going to be, anyway, your turn, so I'm just going to finish in a few seconds. What we learn from all this, the first part and the second part of this talk, is that several factors are in place in order to understand welfare state developments. We have some macro factors, but also we have some micro factors, which are based on the transformation of society. So we have social economic factors, political institutional factors that are also connected to the exogenous pressures, but this is how society changes. So we are adding in pure social factors in terms of pressures, aging, transformation of household, or economic. Of course, we put them in the socioeconomic factors, but if you unpack the socioeconomic factors, you understand in greater detail what are the challenges and what are the pressures and how they can have an impact. So now it's really time to understand how all this played in specific countries. So I stop here, and I'm very curious to know what you can tell me about Lithuania and many other things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We often compare different welfare states within Europe, and then we can find similarities and differences. Here it was amazing to see the comparison with Latin America in a very broad sense. And it's amazing that we are quite different in our welfare states, but still you can see the cycles of expansion and retrenchment, and even often driven by similar factors. So it was really fascinating and interesting. So now questions, comments. Also, Paula talked about different processes like globalization, Europeanization, and other like aging, family transformation, yes, and changes in the mode of productions. And so questions, comments, and also, as I understand, Paolo would be interested also to hear your insight about Lithuania and how Lithuania compares with this dynamics from what you know from the previous courses and so on. We have some questions, observations.
At the beginning of the lecture, you mentioned workfare, and then looking at the endogenous pressures, they all came, well, in my mind to a question: is the workfare the only way to still be able to say that we have a welfare?
Sorry, could you say this last part again? I'm not sure I got it.
Yeah, so just looking at those endogenous pressures,
Yes.
it looked that we have a problem of finding finance to keep welfare. And then when you mentioned at the beginning just the idea of workfare, my question is that is the idea of workfare the only way to go for us?
Not at all. Not at all. We have an international network of people that believe in basic income, a global basic income, which would be very far-fetched, but could be. We need to decommodify a number of aspects, and labor could be one of them. So, as you all know, a basic income perspective would give a dividend to every single person in a given political community, be it a national, international, or global one, and would allow to have some funds, some resources that are not coming from contributions or consequences of contributions, but come from general taxation. So clearly, you would have to have taxes that are organized in a different way. You would have to think, for example, in creative way. Let me give you an example of other ways of thinking. So not only workfare, but also pensions. If you think about how pensions work in most of European countries now, you may have different pillars, but they're increasingly contributory based. And I'm sure you all know what I'm referring to, correct? So.
Well, continue.
So anyway, contributory based, simply it's not general taxation, but you provide a contribution on an individual basis for the entire life, your working life, and then finally you reach 75, 70, 65, depending on the retirement age, and then you finally retire. And you are covered by your contributions for the rest of your life. The problem is that since life is getting longer, you had a number of cases where in the past people could retire at 55, 60, or even earlier. There are some cases, for example, where people retired really very early because they could, and then they were covered by public funding until they were 100. So from an insurance-based perspective, it doesn't work. So if we thought in a different way and we said, okay, we have people that retire, why on earth should there be a connection to what you earned before? That is a contributory-based scheme. You could think, we start from scratch all over again, and you have a minimum pension for all. So it would be a basic pension scheme. And then everything else that should go to the ones that were better off, say top, the middle class and the top income level of the middle class, then instead of having those funds going in that direction, they could be redistributed. So if you follow a much more redistributive logic, you could have some extra funds that are not connected to a workfare approach, on the contrary, are much more universalistic, much more redistributive, that go in the direction of providing greater support to the most in need. But of course, this is something that very few politicians that have chances to win elections will ever put forward, because it goes against the individual perspective of having to count on the individual resources. But why on earth should a university professor retire with a pension level which is 3 times as much of production work? From a principle, discussion that could go into universalistic reading, we could say it's unfair. Because not only the university professor had a wonderful, quote-unquote, life, because he or she did not have to spend 8 hours on a machine that's maybe annihilating. But also, and in old age, you also have lots of fun. And typically, blue-collar workers live much less than university professors. So you could adjust for a number of other factors that currently are not that much taken into consideration. That goes, and all this goes beyond workfare. Universal pension system on the one hand, basic income on the other, also healthcare. You could find different ways of producing healthcare, and then finally also thinking about non-monetary ways of providing support. In the welfare state, in the current welfare state, everything is connected to money, to funds, and to resources that have to be put in place. But we could think differently, and I'm sure you are thinking differently once you open up the box and you do not take the constraints as once and for all.
Yeah, a short comment, maybe, or a side note, is that Lithuanian system is very much based on social contributions. But for the reasons that you named, also like aging for sure is a big issue here. So there is a push toward diversifying funding. So it's not totally into this universal income, but in some respect, we have, for example, now within our social insurance system, the basic part of the pension, which has quite a wide coverage and is similar to social assistance pension, it's now funded from general taxation. So there is, because also Lithuania tries to kind of, from the 90s, positioned itself and its competitiveness based on relatively low labor costs and wants to, for it to remain as such. Yeah. So yeah, so there was there were several reforms, but one of them was towards funding social insurance from the general taxes, and now half of pension roughly comes from general taxation. So actually there is a debate that we may not really call this basic part of the pension social insurance pension anymore, okay, because it's flat and it's funded through general taxes. It's just paid by our social insurance fund. Right. But de facto, if we are transparent, we could take it out of our social insurance fund, combine with social assistance pensions and name it just a basic pension.
Right.
And it would cover 100% of population, because everyone has access, has eligibility to receive it. So indeed, it kind of goes in this direction, a universalistic one that you mentioned, and also due to all the technological, I think, transformations, and that we do need to find different sources of funding. Okay, so this was a little note, because I think that these ideas, they might seem, especially in our region, like basic income. Oh, this is something Finland thinks of, you know, not Lithuania. But actually, the processes go this direction. Also in child benefits that are now universal and so on. Mm-hmm. Okay, so do we have further questions, comments, observations?
How would you characterize the Lithuanian welfare state with reference to what we saw? What are the pressures that are most powerful? Here we have just this is one of those numerous data sets you could use. So if you take OECD and not the European Union, so it's a bit lower, roughly speaking, it's on average as GDP per capita. Labor force participation is wonderful, quote unquote, with reference to other countries. So here you have the European Union is very happy because you're above the 75% average, roughly speaking, of the European Union, because here they call it they call it labor force participation. I assume it's employment rate. There are differences, but it should be high anyway. And in any case, it's higher than the OECD. The needs is in line, it's a bit lower. So youth policies are a bit to be developed, but not at the end that much. Poverty rate higher. This is where you may have some issues, and again the question is poverty increasing due to the exogenous and endogenous factors, or is it not? And the Gini coefficient, it's a bit higher. So yes, you do have, if we want to take a perspective, comparative perspective, some worries with this respect. Rural population is very low, but again, here in the OECD we have a growing number of Latin American countries, but still it's really very low. Actually, I'm surprised, I thought it was higher. And this is an indicator I do not even know that much about, but it's stakeholder engagement for developing regulation. I don't know how they measure it. I will not trust that much, this
that
figure.
seems very
it's
optimistic for Lisbon.
Yeah, 2.4 out of 4, I mean, it would be very high. Again, here I may doubt it. This is, again, when we look at data, let's fully understand what the data tells us. Sometimes it's rubbish, to be quite frank. So let's make sure that we use the right data. This is just to give us an idea. So how did the welfare state develop in Lithuania? If you had to mobilize the theory and you had to write an article, social policy development in Lithuania, what would be your story so far, according to your knowledge? Again, you can answer in Lithuanian if you prefer. I'm really very interested in knowing what you think. So on the one hand, you have exogenous pressures, on the other you have endogenous. In the past 20 years, that more or less coincide with your life, roughly speaking. So I know you cannot take it from your own experience, but thanks to your studies, thanks to just thinking out loud, you may have no data whatsoever. I'm not looking for data. You do not have to justify what you say. I just want to think, I want to know what you think.
All endogenous pressures you mentioned, I think are relevant to Lithuania.
Right.
Also, I would add maybe urbanization.
Okay.
Because I imagine that now Lithuania is having and will have problems to meet housing needs of people. And also, I know it's obviously, but COVID pandemic had really a big impact on our economics, so it will be a really big pressure. And also the war in Ukraine, which we hosted a lot of refugees from Ukraine, and so I think it required an extension of our social protection. Yes.
So how would you know, roughly speaking, how many Ukrainians you're currently hosting? Just to have...
About 70,000.
70,000, okay.
Yes.
It's not that massive as in Poland.
Right.
But our...
There was,
It's 500,000 or so, if not more.
Yeah, but in Lithuania the integration is quite problematic in the sense that for Ukrainians it's easier, but the system of integration of immigrants, because we didn't have much experience with that.
Right.
We always were the country of the net out migration, so it was always negative. So now, there is a challenge, and also I think in the future Lithuania becomes more and more attractive to migrants from third countries. So we might expect more people coming in to work, to study. We also see it already. So we have positive migration, and it's something new because previously we never had that situation. So,
Right.
Integration services is indeed.
So housing actually is also a problem that is emerging in many other countries. It's not household restructuring. It's something different that is connected to urbanization, but it's also connected to the Airbnbization, as it has been called, of a number of capitals, a number of cities. So now, after the COVID-19 crisis, you have also not so well-known cities. Padova, the university, the city where my university is, now has a big issue with students housing, for example, because there's Milano, Rome, because even if they're not so touristy, they are in a global tourism circuit, and this may not be the case of Vilnius yet, but given its beauty, for sure, will happen very soon. And then it will be increasingly difficult, not only due to the urbanization process, but also to the touristization or touristification of centers that also are historical centers, art-based centers. So it's something that is becoming increasingly relevant. Other factors coming from others and or other ideas.
Okay. What other trends
Or other trends,
factors you see that in the longer term might be important?
Maybe privatization of healthcare and education. It brings more inequality.
So here we could think in terms of retrenchment of public welfare state, but has this, the way I see it, the limited information I have, this was something that already started in the democratic transition, so it's something that was there in the 90s, or am I wrong?
It wasn't, but I think it also continues. So at that point, I think that in the 90s there was really very strong influence of this external actors, yes, of World Bank and the IMF, because really it was a very sensitive period, and there was a need for funds, for loans, yes, to restructure the economy and so on. So there was a big push, but I think it's a continuous trend. Yeah.
Okay, so privatization, and therefore it's a sign of retrenchment.
Yeah.
What about welfare expansion? Do we have any sector where...
Or any period. Maybe.
Or any, sorry?
Yeah. Or any period.
Or any period, exactly.
Yes.
Maybe in the past, indeed. In these 30 years, if we start with 1992, roughly, would you just characterize it as, I mean, privatization would be retrenchment, but okay, it's also with reference to a non-democratic period, so then it's something that has always been there, but are there also other signs that go in different direction?
I don't know if it counts as expansion, but in 2 years ago, in 2022, when we had really high inflation rates, our allowances and pensions were really increased due to this factor. So I don't know if it counts, but it was a really good reaction to the crisis.
So yeah, it's maintenance. Actually, something that consolidation we could call it in our terms, in terms of having, coping with the challenges, not in a retrenchment manner, but rather in a, sorry, I'm allergic to this, but I need it because I wanted to take the notes on the board. So yeah, this could be seen as consolidation or maintenance for sure.
Yeah.
Other trends or factors?
Maybe I add here a comment. There is actually a research, and actually I'm sure that students did read. We have, for example, a research by Jolanta Kaita, and she actually made kind of similar periodization of our welfare state, and showed the periods of retrenchment and expansion. And yes, we already spoke about the 90s, which was definitely the retrenchment period, and we had to reorganize the welfare state, and also it was a period of economic instability. So really all the attention was given to stabilizing the economy, yes, and then also there was this is very important that Lithuania regained independence at the peak of the Washington Consensus, and all this quite neoliberal agenda, and naturally coming from a socialistic era, there was probably a natural push towards liberalization, privatization, and so in our region, yes, there was definitely like retrenchment also because there were very little funds available. And the globalization at that period also, like for a small economy, and we are a small and open economy, so globalization also kicked in, so a big push towards opening, yes, and liberalizing the trade and so on. And then the period of expansion of the welfare state is definitely the Lithuanian accession to the EU and the period before the economic crisis. Because you mentioned this may be interesting that in Europe, this still kind of you mentioned the race to the bottom, yes, and when the new member state joined, yes, so that put pressure on the Western state, as I see it, yes, and this race to the bottom at least partly began. But for us, it was actually an upwards convergence, because we were those at the bottom. So
the bottom of the bottom.
Yes, yes. So for Lithuania, also Lithuania, other countries that wanted to access, yes, the bloc, they had to enhance their social protection, their social systems, and then also after accession got a lot of funds that were also used for strengthening the social social protection or social services, infrastructure, and invested in healthcare, education, and so on. And then there was a retrenchment after their economic crisis. That, yeah, you mentioned that it was also very different in different regions. In Lithuania, it was like really not a double dip, but it was a single dip, but a very deep dip.
A very deep dip.
Yes, yes, yes. And in this sense, the comment of Agata was that, yes, with the COVID, it was a different dynamics, but you are right that it is not probably, yes, expansion, but just consolidation and trying to keep at least the standards at the levels that we had. And still, I think you would admit that with the levels of inflation we faced here, which were very high, it was only partially done. But, yeah. But otherwise, yeah, I think many, for example, the modes of production, the move towards services, yeah, that's a huge tendency. Also, I don't know, Lina, do you want to add anything on the family transformation and yeah.
I was thinking also, for example, covering maternity leave, there was also expansion until 2008, since I think 2004. There was a period for several years when it was covered 100% for 2 years, the second year 80%. So, and then again it was decided to shrink it down. But no, professor is not here, Romas. He also offered, for example, that some years ago when we had a project on COVID crisis or something like that, and there was an offer, for example, maternity leave, it might be a basic one, not connected to employment, and his logic was that if it is paid just for looking after the child, so why some women who earn less or who studied before pregnancy are on the less valuable position than those who has been employed? And coming from this logic, everybody should get for the work they do. So if you stay at home, you are paid for the looking after the child.
Right. Sure. That would be,
Yeah, so this
vulgarly called the housewife allowance, right?
Housewife allowance, or something like that. And we have also another thing like this poverty, employment poverty, or that our salaries are not so high that even
the working poor phenomenon.
That's why we are employed very on the high rate, but our income might be we might be anyway on the poverty rate, even single person is employed, or it depends what kind of employment is. So, and I wanted to add about education, for example, transformation in healthcare. We got a lot of funds, but there is again criticized that we haven't made a reform in the health system. Doctors again don't get higher salaries and so on. And in the education, private schools, we have double funding. We get from the government and from parents. And this is also debatable, that we are using welfare state. We of course then can provide better education, can pay better for the teachers, but then on the cost of public schools. And in public schools, for example, parents are in the situation that we have to add some finances to the schools on the informal side. So I would say that there are some standards of the welfare state which are established already, and some are going on the debates. And I don't know where we will go. It depends what kind of political party is on the...
But for you have elections on the 12th of May. This is presidential election?
This year is a year of free elections. So we have both for parliament and presidential and the European elections.
And what are the forecasts with reference to the domestic? Will the coalition for welfare expansion or welfare retrenchment win? What are...
we had a discussion on pensions just several weeks ago, so I don't know what kind of message was that we should provide better the system, but in what ways?
But I think that currently, like in the government, there are like a conservative party, and they were often associated with retrenchment and with push towards more liberalization, and social democrats might be getting momentum, and also there might be, from the discussion on pension, there were even some talks about some unexpected possible coalitions between the conservatives and social democrats, well, I think also the parties here in Lithuania and are quite peculiar in the sense that there are studies that show that we have this left and right-wing parties, but actually even the left-wing parties are very often quite liberal in their social policy.
This is a common trend in terms of convergence at the center, quote unquote.
Yes. So this is also very visible here.
So let me just ask a final question, if I may, to you. What would be the first thing you would change in your welfare state if you had the power to do so?
I would create some housing insurance. I don't know, because I read that in China, in some cities, they have, it's like, I don't know, our pension insurance, they have something like housing insurance, and people are paying contributions, and then when they're ready to buy a house, state helps them to do it. So I imagine that it would be nice to have something like that in Spain, and it would help to address the future challenges of houses.
So housing first, what else? A couple of other voices before we say goodbye.
Distribution of
Okay, so here would be tax policy to change. It will be the funding of the welfare altogether, so you have more funds to input into the system. Very good. Anything else? What about education? What about university? Are you happy with the fees you pay?
We don't pay.
But none of you pay. So this is something you would not want to change, I guess, right? But you do not pay because you have scholarships? Because otherwise there are fees that have to be paid. So and there's no, I do not want to know who pays and who doesn't, of course, but there's nobody that pays actually.
No, there are.
There are
If
some.
you don't do well in school, then...
But it's a merit-based.
Yes, it's very
so,
meritocratic.
I mean, you're all wonderful, I guess, or if not, some of you pay, but for those who pay, it's acceptable. You don't want to change it that much because we were having this discussion. So education, university education is also seen as fostering knowledge. So you could also make an argument that just like in the Nordic countries, one thing that is often overlooked, you paid zero, but not because you're on a merit-based system, but because it's a citizen, if you wish, right, just to go to university. So it's 0, 0, 0. And actually you used to have, I do not know if you still have it, you used to have a stipend as a student. So you had a student's allowance, which for us from Italy is, you know, a paradise. Never heard of that
It's a symbolic.
But you, okay, but
yeah.
still.
Okay, so I think that we could continue probably, but we need to finish, and I urge you to give another round of applause for this very nice lectures yesterday and today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I think that there will be some time needed to internalize the knowledge, so I will send through the slides and materials, and then we can discuss further during our lectures. And if there are some remaining questions, then you can ask, and if I can't answer, then I can forward something to you as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again.